those that weren't here this morning, this is a session that Ed and I cooked up together. We did it originally about 10 years ago. And the idea was to get all of the coastal regional monitoring programs around the country together so we could kind of learn from each other, right? See what we're doing the same, see what we're doing different, see how we can improve. And so we decided to reprise the role and include more of the regional monitoring programs. So to kick us off this afternoon, I'm going to have Ed Sherwood from the Tampa Bay Estuary Program present to us about his regional program.
Not on the Seine River in Curtis.
No, have at it.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate everyone joining this afternoon. So as Ken mentioned, this is kind of revisiting a session that we developed and also a special issue back in 2015. And my angle I'm going at for this talk for the Tampa Bay Estuary is kind of give you a little bit of update since that time period where we actually experienced probably peak conditions in terms of overall health of Tampa Bay and sort of the changes that we've observed through our various monitoring programs and some of the partners that we work with to sort of come up with a new vision based on some of the perturbations we're seeing, particularly as it relates to seagrass beds in Tampa Bay. That's been our sort of sentinel indicator of overall estuarine health, similar to other estuaries throughout the nation. So a lot of our water quality monitoring and management is tied directly to allowing for persistent seagrass coverage throughout the Tampa Bay. So I did want to recognize a bunch of my co-authors here. Dr. Marcus Beck is in the room. He's our open science guru at the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. Maya Burke, assistant directors, also great support there. And then I have a couple of names up there from each of our county partners. And these county partners have been the ones responsible for our long-term monitoring in the Tampa Bay region, in some cases going all the way back to the early 1970s. So we have a 50-year data set in some cases throughout the Tampa Bay Estuary that we've relied on to manage water quality resources in the estuary. So if you're not familiar with where the Tampa Bay Estuary is, we're on the west central coast of the Florida Peninsula, kind of about an hour and a half from Orlando Disney World, if you've visited there. Our watershed is fairly developed, and through that development activity, there's been various impacts through time, but I like to say we're not too big and not too small. We're a moderate sized watershed in about 2,200 square miles. But within that 2,200 square miles, we have now about 3.1 million people living, working, and playing in the Tampa Bay region. And with that population has come various land use impacts as colored in the diagram to the right. So those red areas are basically suburban or urban development in our watershed as it stands right now. The yellow areas are the remnant agriculture that still remains. And the purple areas are actually phosphate mining lands that are being actively mined or are being reclaimed. So we have a big phosphate mining presence in some of our headwater riverine areas. So those patches of green are basically the native habitats that are left. We only have about 32% of natural land still remaining in the watershed, if you don't count like urban open spaces and parks like that. So we're a fairly developed watershed, and with those watershed development activities, there's been impacts over the years. And a lot of the work that we've done has been focused on trying to reduce nutrient loads to the Tampa Bay Estuary through various sources. Predominantly in the 1970s and early 80s, the largest source of nutrients to the bay were from point source, primarily domestic wastewater treatment plants that were at generally secondary treatment levels. So at the time, about 60% of the nitrogen going into Tampa Bay was coming from those point sources. But we've done a tremendous amount of work and investment to ratchet down on those nutrient loads. And presently, we have about 2/3 less of nutrient loads going into Tampa Bay. And we're really proud of that because that has had real water quality improvement benefits to our estuary, and it has resulted in the recovery of seagrasses. So I like to say our original nutrient management strategy and paradigm was focused on, really trying to reduce those nutrient loads so that we reduce the propensity for algal blooms, we improve water clarity so that sunlight could reach the bay bottom and seagrasses could proliferate. And that's been sort of our bread and butter since our program started in the early 1990s. And sort of along the management timeline, those sort of overall paradigms have been translated into various targets, which have resulted in limits to about 189 discrete permitted sources that discharge nutrient loads into Tampa Bay. They're represented by the list of about 45 different entities represented in the watershed. They're both public and private entities. So there's industrial point sources and folks that have industrial stormwater permits, as well as municipal wastewater treatment plants and MS4 operators that have a nitrogen regulatory oversight as relates to their permits. And each one of our bay segments, there's 4 main bay segments in the Tampa Bay that we colloquially refer to. The table on the left is referring to our old Tampa Bay segment, which is the upper left-hand lobe of Tampa Bay. Those are basically all the sources within that bay segment. We further carved up sort of that load that's now going into the bay to an allowable piece of the pie to each one of those entities. And we've scaled some of that allowable load based on hydrologic conditions. So it's sort of been a flexible TMDL as it relates to that bottom line number that you could probably barely see there, which is 486 tons of total nitrogen per year. But that has been more or less sort of the agreement that has taken place within our watershed and all our partners to maintain sort of those nutrient loading levels at that sort of TMDL limit in order to maintain adequate water quality for Tampa Bay. And there's triggers if those things don't occur. We do annual assessments kind of similar to other programs where there's report card function. A lot of it ours are based on a red, yellow, green sort of stoplight graphic. And usually the first trigger is water quality related chlorophyll A conditions within each of the major bay segments. As I mentioned, if we're not meeting those standards for 2 concurrent years, and we start ratcheting down both at the bay segment level, looking at that total load going to the bay, and then at finer scales to each individual entity and seeing where there might be sort of disconnects with not meeting those targets. And this sort of process is served us well, like I said, over the past couple of decades. It's led to fairly significant seagrass recovery in the Tampa Bay estuary. We peaked at our overall seagrass coverage of a little bit over 41,600 acres back in 2016. But since that time, we've started seeing some problematic areas in Tampa Bay, and that as of recently has been indicated by a precipitous drop in sort of that seagrass coverage from about 2016 to about 2022, where we lost a little bit over 11,000 acres of seagrass over that 6 to 7 year time period. So that really caused us pause as a management entity and working with our partners on trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Up to that point, based on the numeric nutrient criteria that were translated from some of those TMDLs, we were showing on a nitrogen per unit water delivery ratio declines in overall nutrient loads going into Tampa Bay, but we've also observed sort of variation around the absolute load. So we suspect some of those issues were starting to take place and impacting seagrass resources, although it wasn't necessarily translated in other water quality metrics. So that kind of led us down this path of asking the question of how do we now adaptively manage the system for the benefit of continued seagrass recovery, particularly in this one embayment that is, like I said, the upper left-hand lobe of Tampa Bay and Old Tampa Bay. And we've seen some changes in the overall ecology. We actually have seen persistent summertime blooms of a harmful algal bloom called Pyridinium bahamenti. This has started occurring in the 2010s, but basically every year, every summer around May time period, right before a rainy season, it starts to take hold in this part of the estuary. And a lot of it is due to the biology of this organism. It really capitalizes on areas of an estuary that has poor tidal circulation, but it is also responding to nutrient inputs. So sort of that complication further adds to the management conundrum for this particular bay segment, because we can't really rely on nitrogen management alone to reduce the propensity and duration of this bloom in the future. So this sort of kind of sprang into our management ethos and started us thinking down the road of, how do we look at other levers that can be pulled other than nutrient management that would help control this bloom in the future. And a lot of the tools that we've relied on use open science dashboards. Like I said, Dr. Marcus Beck is in the audience today. He's been a leader for our program of developing a lot of these products for us and actually expanding the congregation to our other county partners. There's going to be a session, I think, in this room, same time tomorrow, with Dr. Marcus Beck, as well as Alex Manos from Pinellas County, one of our partners, to kind of talk about some of their dashboards that they developed. This, I feel, is another sort of piece of the adaptive management puzzle, making sure that our data are transparent, that we're sharing this information, that we're building on information from the past by also making it accessible for future researchers to tap into and kind of interrogate. So we have various sort of dashboards that kind of have relayed this sort of change in the phytoplankton community based on ambient water quality monitoring that has been ongoing, like I said, in some cases going back to the 1970s in the Tampa Bay estuary. This is data from one of those counties, the Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County, and they've been maintaining about 54 stations that we rely on for our annual reporting, like I said, going back to the early 1970s. So as I mentioned, we've started to see this disconnect in terms of regulatory criteria and thresholds that have been adopted from the development of that TMDL that have been translated to certain chlorophyll A conditions on an annual average basis. And there's been this disconnect in terms of how we've been looking at the loading on a per hydrologic input basis, which is now basically our rules in the state of Florida that have been adopted by our State Department of Environmental Protection, as well as EPA as our numeric nutrient criteria for the Tampa Bay estuary. And while we've been meeting those nitrogen load targets and those numeric nutrient criteria related to nitrogen loading, we haven't been meeting them in terms of the chlorophyll A conditions. So there's been this disconnect in terms of the overall management of the bay. And we've been trying to rectify that to the past couple of basically over this past year and into this year of developing a new, what we call a summative capacity for the old Tampa Bay segment. So really deciding whether or not the nutrient diet is sufficient moving forward in this bay segment. And we think it's probably not the case. So there's been some work kind of revisiting that, as well as extending our monitoring and understanding of other compounding factors that might be adding to the overall recovery effort. So we've been actually placing these little onset temperature loggers in the summertime months just to get an understanding of whether or not this is a compounding stressor to the continuing persistence and recovery of seagrass beds in this particular bay segment. We actually see temperatures in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit in some of our shallow areas during the summer months. So we know that's probably a compounding factor that's going to require maybe even better water quality in the future to get those seagrasses back and allow them to persist. So we've been doing basically a small little study looking at where seagrasses currently exist and where they've been lost over the past several years, and trying to get an understanding of those peak summertime temperatures as we move forward in the future, to see how that could be sort of an additive factor that we take into account as we talk about what water quality is needed in the future. And along the same lines, with that increased heat capacity within the region, we're also seeing overall changes in hydrologic inputs to this bay segment. So the graph on the upper left is, in the blue lines, is basically the absolute load, nitrogen load coming into the bay segment. That red line is the hydrologically normalized load. So on a per nitrogen and hydrologic basis, that red line shows a decreasing trend. That's a good thing. We're seeing, the amount of nitrogen coming into the estuary has been decreasing, but the overall absolute load is somewhat trending up, and that's kind of related to the overall hydrologic inputs to the system. We're actually seeing sort of rainier deluge events, so more intense rainfall events, seeing a lot of coastal development that's probably allowing a lot of those deluge events now being quickly transported into the estuary. So that, again, is sort of another compounding factor that we now have to take into account for when we did develop those original numeric nutrient criterion targets. We were looking at a time period between 1992 and 1994. So we know hydrologic conditions have changed a whole hell of a lot in the Tampa Bay region. And we have to now factor that into the overall management as well. So the path we're on is taking into account those stressors. There's a recent paper that's out there. There's the DOI and a link at the bottom of the slide there. But basically what we're saying, Tampa Bay is getting hotter and fresher based on those changing climatic indicators within the region. So that has implications in terms of the overall persistence of seagrass beds, because again, that's a compounding stressor that we didn't have to deal with or contend with in the past. We're now seeing and recognizing it as sort of that compounding stressor, and we're asking our partners, what should water quality look like in the face of these compounding factors, and how do we better manage the system towards these trajectories that we know are going to continue to occur within the estuary. So sort of a first sort of baby step towards that end was really getting with our partners and seeing if we could take a step back and really look at the numeric nutrient criteria that have been developed, namely focused on that nitrogen per unit water input, and asking the question whether or not those are still relevant. And a lot of the initial data analysis that we've had some contractors help us out with over the past year indicate that no, that criteria is probably not relevant anymore. And what makes more sense is probably us rolling back and looking at that absolute load condition, that bright line of once we exceed that nitrogen load, that 486 tons per year TMDL, we're probably going to get water quality conditions that are not conducive to continued seagrass recovery. So we're at the graphs on the left are basically just indicating that normalized TN load is probably insufficient now to characterize whether or not we had attained chlorophyll A levels at that annual average basis that have developed in the past. I went back quick. Likewise, we're also looking at developing more subsegment and temporal criteria as sort of early indicators of whether or not we're on the right path if we hold true to those absolute loads. So we've developed some subsegment chlorophyll A criteria primarily centered around whether or not we're having an effect on that harmful algal bloom pyridinium, just to get basically an early indicator as we move forward. So these are sort of complementary management targets that we're developing and recommended to kind of look at in the future. And all this is going to require buy-in of our partners. We don't work in isolation. We work with those regulated individuals as well as the regulatory bodies who regulate those, both domestic and industrial sources of nutrient inputs to the bay. And luckily, we've had some great cooperation through a group we facilitate called the Tampa Bay Nitrogen Management Consortium. We actually developed a declaration of cooperation going into some of this work, so they would sign on and participate in good faith that we're going to work together on solving this issue. And what this will result in is basically in the state of Florida, there's a determination called reasonable assurance that we could submit that basically shows the state how we're going to be working together to meet these numeric nutrient criteria and the adjusted recommendations that I just explained in the future. And so far, we've had great buy-in with that. We'll see how it goes if it starts affecting their permit conditions. But I think at this point, it's not. It's just going to hold them to a brighter line. So that has been sort of one of the ingredients and recipes to some of our success in the past was getting that group to have buy-in. And then, just to sum it up, is that the bay has been evolving We're seeing changes to some of the tried and true criteria and recommendations that we've made in the past. So we want to be fleet and adapt our management and make sure our partners have buy-in for these new recommendations moving forward because we know the base ecologies are changing. So our next steps is basically tapping into those individuals, understanding what projects are going to be that they're planning to put in place to see how closer we'll get to meeting those chlorophyll targets as well as those nutrient load targets. And hopefully that will put us on a better trajectory moving forward, particularly in water quality and restoring some seagrass. And we do have some positive news that'll be coming out soon in our latest 2024 seagrass assessment. We've actually seen an uptick of seagrasses a little bit. Unfortunately, that's been everywhere except for this one bay segment I mentioned in Old Tampa Bay. We've actually seen a continual decline. That bay segment, when these numbers come out, it's going to be at its all-time lowest based on data going back to the 1950s. So it's something that we continue to monitor and hopefully motivate the community moving forward to better management in the future. So let's stop there.
Thanks, Ed. We have time for about one question. Does anybody have a question for Ed? None? All right. I'll ask you one while I switch slides here. First of all, thanks for saving that little uptick at the end. That was a good way to finish. So I'm really curious about your adaptive management. Maybe you can explain that just in a short bit, and then tell me how the government entities, including the regulators, are warming up to that idea. Pardon the temperature pun.
Yeah, I think as a national SJ program, I think we feel we're charged with adaptively managing the system. I think if we didn't call to attention this disconnect between maintaining chlorophyll conditions on an annual average basis and sort of these nutrient loading trends that I talked about, then I don't think anyone else would be looking at it. So we've been driving sort of the bus in terms of understanding the changes that are occurring in the estuary and, again, creating that buy-in, holding hands along the way to have our partners join us on this journey of adaptively managing the system, because no one likes to change is hard sometimes. So once things are established, it's hard to kind of convince folks that we might need something different, especially if the ecosystem has changed. So we're part of that dialogue and sort of creating that future to do the work we do as a national issue.
There you go. Change is hard. So, all right. Thank you, Ed. All right. Our next speaker is Katie Mae Lauman from the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. Katie.
Hi. So the report card I'm going to be discussing today was the first step in developing a monitoring program to monitor resilience for the state of Maryland and various communities within the state. And it was completed with the input of many, many stakeholders across the state of Maryland, but shepherded by my team, which consists of Annie Carew and Heath Kelsey, who are at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science with me, and Allison Brightonothers, who is at the Maryland Department of Transportation. So before I get into the development of the report card, I'd just like to introduce you to the area where we focused our work. The Chesapeake Bay watershed is situated in the northeastern part of the United States along the Atlantic coast, and it includes New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Washington, D.C., West Virginia, and Virginia. And within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, our work focused on the coastal counties in the state of Maryland, and they're shown here on the map in purple. This project was first proposed by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources because they recognize that Maryland is subject to a lot of different climate threats, and the coastal counties in particular are subjected to a lot of these and are the first to experience them. They include severe storms and flooding, coastal erosion, and wetland loss. You can see some of these on the diagram. Recognizing these effects of climate change, The state invested in a lot of resilience building activities for both ecosystem resilience and community resilience, primarily along the coast. And decisions on what actions were taken to build resilience were made primarily by government planners and didn't necessarily consider what people on the ground facing these challenges day to day were dealing with. So they recognized that it was important to identify what was of most concern to the general public. And this project was designed to do that. We worked with communities to identify what climate threats were most urgent to them to address. We had over 100 stakeholders participate in this. That's 100 stakeholders who were not related to the government entities that commissioned this work. And we worked with them to identify adaptation goals that would indicate that their community was resilient to climate change and ready to withstand some of these threats. And ultimately, the framework that we developed is useful to monitor progress and the effectiveness of different adaptation actions that are taken from community to the state level. Before I continue, I just want to recognize that our unit at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science recognizes that our offices sit on land that originally belonged to the Piscataway, Nintego, and Susquehannock nations. And we acknowledge and appreciate that Indigenous people were the original caretakers of the lands and waters that we're working to protect. And we're committed to inclusive engagement of people across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And the work I'm presenting today was conducted on and for the protection of lands and communities of diverse peoples, including the Piscataway Indian Nation, Piscataway Conway Tribe, and the Akahannock Indian Tribe. People from all of these groups engaged in the work, but they declined to be mentioned by name in resulting publications and in this talk. You might be asking exactly how do we engage diverse groups of people in our work? We follow a framework shown on the screen for all of our community-driven work. We develop projects by collaboratively conceptualizing what we're going to do. And then we work with communities to choose indicators by which we can measure environmental or ecosystem health or climate resilience. Then we determine thresholds that convey a resilient condition or a healthy ecosystem and compare current conditions to those thresholds to calculate grades from an A to F scale or a 100% to 0% scale. And just like in a school report card, an A is the best score you can get. If you get an A for an indicator, that means that that indicator is meeting resilience goals. And if you get an F, that means that you're failing to meet resilience goals and you need to do a lot more work. And our final step is communicating these results to decision makers and the general public. The results that we're looking at today were communicated to the public in a report card here. I have copies of it, or I'll share a link at the end of the talk with you if you want to look at it. And I work with state decision makers to provide advice based on the information and the data that we collected. Like I said before, we engaged over 100 different participants in our work to identify the biggest climate threats based on their lived experience and developed the indicators of resilience, and finally compared current conditions to targets that are based in science and translated those into our grades. Our indicators of resilience are shown on this slide. I don't expect you to read them all. We're going to go over a few of them in more detail shortly, but the image shown here is downtown Annapolis, Maryland, near where our office is situated during a flood event. People were literally kayaking down the street, pretty scary. We flood pretty often, not necessarily this badly, but expect it to get worse in the future. We display our indicator scores in stoplight colors on resilience wheels shown here. And the cooler colors, beginning with dark green and moving to light green, represent an A or B score, meaning you meet or are close to meeting your targets. A yellow is a score of C, meaning you're halfway there, but you still have more work to do. And a D and F, which are shown in orange and red, convey that you're very far from meeting your resilience targets and you need a lot more investment to become resilient. For example, shoreline erosion up here is shown in light green, so it scores a B, and that tells us that shoreline erosion is close to meeting targets. And this was actually used as a proxy for living shorelines. We wanted to assess the extent of living shorelines across the state, but coast-wide data were not available for this. So instead, we used erosion rates, which increase when living shorelines are not present, as a proxy for resilience conferred by living shorelines. On the other hand, critical facilities is shown here in red, so it scores an F. This indicator addresses whether facilities that are necessary for humans to access in emergency situations are in flood-prone areas. So if hospitals, emergency services, and shelters cannot be accessed during an emergency due to flooding, this indicator would score an F or red, as it does. Most of ours are in flood-prone areas. I think we only have one along our coast that is not in flood-prone areas. So that means that these facilities need to be adapted to better withstand climate change, or they need to be relocated in the future as they're replaced. Based on the insights that we gained from these scores, we generated recommendations for increasing resilience, and I work to share these with decision makers by serving on various working groups. And we can also use this as a framework to monitor progress moving forward. So we're working on getting funding to do a 5-year update. And perhaps most importantly, we're using this as a model for similar assessments at different geographic levels. The reason we want to use this at different geographic levels rather than just say this is what's important across the state is that not all indicators are going to be applicable to smaller scale locations or measurable. There may not be the same amount of data for a small community as there is for the state as a whole, and vice versa. So new indicators may be warranted based on differing community concerns and different priority threats that are facing communities, and based on the availability of better or more refined data. We're moving to Charles County, which is shown in, looks like dark brown on the screen. And this land is the home of the Piscataway Conoy tribe. They participated in this work. Just want to acknowledge them. Charles County is unique in Maryland. It's one of the most forested counties in the state and one of the counties with the fewest wetlands of our coastal counties. And in assessing resilience, we needed to account for planned development that the county has authorized, which is resulting in forest loss. So we cannot, for example, score any level of forest loss too badly because it has already been approved by the county and it has already been determined to not have a huge effect on resilience. Which indicators did we keep from the state to the county level, refine, or add? Indicators that did not change in the way we measured them is the availability of flood mapping tools, the level of flood loss coverage or flood insurance that's held, businesses' preparedness to withstand disruptions due to climate events, the location of critical facilities, and whether repetitive flood loss properties are mitigated for climate change. We refined quite a few indicators. One of those was shoreline erosion, which you'll remember at the state level was used as a proxy for living shorelines. At the county level, we were able to get data on the full extent of living shorelines for the county. So rather than look at shoreline erosion rates, we assessed living shorelines and found that in fact, most of the county's shorelines are made up of living shorelines, so they scored a B. This serves as a model for what the state can do in developing data that will allow us to refine indicators in the next phase of this project. I won't go over the other indicators that we changed. Really exciting, we were able to add a lot of indicators that deal with equity, including air quality, heat tolerance from community to community, tree equity, and park equity. All of these will be included in the next state level report card as well. And we're currently working on comparing sub-watershed equity indicators to socioeconomic concerns. So the results of this report card will be coming out later this spring. I have them. I can't share them. They haven't been published yet. So stay tuned. And we're not stopping at the county level. We're currently working on a project to apply this framework at the community level in two very different communities in Maryland. The gentrifying Eastport community, which is where our main office is based, and the Pine Street community on the Eastern Shore. And the Pine Street community is an officially designated historic African-American neighborhood. As you might imagine, the concerns in these communities are very, very different from one another, as well as being very different from the main concerns at the county level and at the state level. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have results from these community assessments coming out early next year. If you want to see the coastal adaptation report card, you can get it at the tiny URL on the screen, or I have copies of it, and please feel free to shoot me an email if you have questions.
Anybody? Nothing. Okay, I have a question for
Okay.
you. So, so we've been through the same process in Southern California. And it's easy, I don't want to say easy, but especially these facilitated processes coming up with the metrics. That's not easy, but it's not as hard as coming up with the thresholds.
Correct.
So talk to us a little bit about how you came up with the thresholds.
So some of the thresholds were based on state targets. So what the state government has already identified as this means resilience. We took those targets to the communities and said, okay, if this happened, do you think it would benefit your community? If the state was to do this, put in a seawall or put in a living shoreline, do you think it would impact the level of flooding that you're facing or not? We are ground truthing those for the Charles County report card. We haven't been able to do that for the statewide report card, but we're hoping to do that in the next assessment. Essentially, we took government targets and then looked at them at various community levels to see if they are appropriate or not and adjusted them.
Okay, so that didn't sound so hard.
It
Sounded
was
easy. Any other questions for Katie Mae? Nothing. You guys are just after lunch. You have one more question, Katie.
So, yeah, I really appreciate this way of displaying this information. Obviously, a lot of data into metrics. The level that's being shown in that highlight is described is a very public information tool. Say if someone wants to dig deeper, is the underlying information available, accessible?
Yes, we have methods documents, we have the R code all available. I believe the methods document is publicly available. The R code is not yet. I'm working on getting it up on GitHub. But that'll be coming soon. And if you email me, I'll share whatever data, whatever method you want. Some of the data we're not able to share. A lot of it did come from the federal government, and we can share summarized versions of it, but we cannot share a lot of it.
Did you find that any of the metrics in that circle of life there, were there some metrics that were more sensitive than others?
More sensitive
I
than.
mean, they turn up red more often than,
Oh, yeah, critical facilities is always going to be red or orange, and Maryland just, well, in coastal Maryland, just because we are so low lying.
Mhm.
So for some of these indicators, your goal might be that none of these facilities are flood prone areas, but that goal may not be achievable. You might be actually shooting for something yellow if you want an achievable goal, but in an ideal world, none of them would be flood prone areas, so you would have a dark green. And that's when you look for other ways to deal with the issue, and we look at mitigating those facilities rather than relocating them. That's if it's not possible to move them.
I don't know.
Ian has typically done water quality report cards in the past. Are these resilient ones a new effort?
Can you repeat the question so they can?
Oh, yeah, but he said that Ian has done water quality reports in the past, and is this new initiative? So, yes, getting into the climate resilience work is something that we had wanted to do for a long time. But until this project, we didn't have the funding to do that, and we're working on building our climate resilience program now.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
Sorry, jumping in. We also are doing socioeconomic environmental report cards, and doing social and economic indicators, not just ecosystem water quality.
That'll be cool. When's that gonna be done?
So Katie May is actually giving another talk about the Chesapeake Bay report card, which has social and economic indicators in it for the entire watershed already. And we've done other work around the country. Happy to discuss.
Yeah, that sounds super cool. So. All right, you ready to move on to our third and final talk of the morning, afternoon? Sorry, I'm still jet lagged. All right, our last talk is from Kim Cressman, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. My name is Kim Cressman. I currently am running a consulting company called Catbird Stats, but for almost 15 years, I have worked with the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. I was full-time with them for 12 years before starting this other company. And I'm going to talk to you about their system-wide monitoring program. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System was established in 1972 under the Coastal Zone Management Act. It's a partnership between NOAA and the coastal states. So 70% of any reserves funding comes from NOAA, and the other 30% comes from state partners, which can be universities, nonprofits, or state agencies. There are currently 30 reserves and at least 2 in the pipeline. I haven't heard anything new recently. There's already a pin on this map for Louisiana, which is one of these new ones, and Green Bay is also going to be established. So you can see we cover all of the coasts, including Great Lakes and Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. Very widespread. And even though research is in the name, we do more than just research. We do stewardship, try to figure out good land management practices, and lots of education and outreach to a wide variety of audiences. So this national network has common goals, but we're also very place-based. And so many of the, for example, stewardship and education and outreach programs, and even the research, are really based on local priorities and what you need, with certain consistencies throughout the system, but we're not all the same. One of these things that is consistent throughout the system is what's called the System-Wide Monitoring Program, or SWAMP. I'm trying not to use acronyms too much in this talk, but I'm probably going to say SWAMP a lot. This program was established in 1995. And the goal was to quantify short-term variability and long-term change. I probably don't have to tell the people in this room why monitoring is a good thing, but it does come under a lot of fire. And there's a paper that defines different types of monitoring. And I would say the system-wide monitoring program started off as sort of surveillance monitoring. What is happening? What is normal? And I think this kind of monitoring is very important. You have to know your resource to be able to manage it. Preaching to the choir, but I had to say it. So we throw around this phrase a lot of quantify short-term variability and long-term change. The data is consistently collected. We use actually the same equipment, the same data management techniques, the same QA/QC, and data is all stored in a centralized database. So you can get results not only from one reserve, but from all 30. Well, all 30 might not have the program in place yet, but this is a piece of the reserve system that is required to maintain your funding. Every reserve has at least 4 water quality stations where we have YSIs deployed that collect the normal things, salinity, temperature, oxygen, every 15 minutes. And those same stations get sampled monthly for nutrients. There's also at least 1 weather station at each reserve. Some reserves have more, some have many more, but 4 and 1 are the minimum. And these data get used at multiple scales. A lot of what we've been seeing in these sessions today has been really great examples of how data like this gets used, specifically in regional management applications. And I'm sort of an oddball in this session because I'm talking about this national program and sort of the consistency of the data collection and some of the cool things that it can be used for. So there's a preprint that's out with Caitlin Reinl as the lead author, Robert Dunn, Chris Kincaid, and myself. And we list a lot of the things that are being done with swamp data specifically, and why monitoring programs like this can be good, not just for surveillance monitoring, but how it can contribute to answering basic and applied research questions. So I'm kind of gonna give just a 10,000-foot overview of some of these uses, and I encourage you to check out this preprint if you're interested. We had a little bit of trouble finding a home for the paper, but we just submitted revisions, so hopefully it will be published soon. Some of these things happen at the national level, some of them are a very local level, and some of them are more in between, more regional. So I'm gonna start at the small level. Many reserves data goes into TMDL development. Many reserves participate in regional observing systems, like this was referred to recently as the OOSs, IUS, GCUS, all of the ocean observing systems, or regional report cards. Some of the ones we've seen today probably have NIRS data going into them. If something's going on in the region, NIRS data is probably involved. They're used in forecasting for some really cool applications. A lot of it is temperature data, salinity data, but forecasting Vibrio in Great Bay, New Hampshire, forecasting river flows in the hydrologic prediction system from the Southeast River Forecast Center, a beach conditions reporting system, both in the Southeast and the Great Lakes, and Shellcast, which is forecasting water quality condition in shellfish harvesting waters in the Southeast and in Florida. Lots of us love looking at monitoring data to determine effects of storms like hurricanes. There are several publications about this, and this is not comprehensive, but individual reserves look at this and publish on it. And people take data from across multiple reserves and publish on it. Walter et al. In 2022 they created an algorithm to pull out the signal of storms in this high frequency water quality data. And Buelo et al. 2023 applied that algorithm to dig in more to storm events, impacts, and recovery. Data are also used for fisheries management, identifying hypoxia in estuaries and linkages to offshore populations. We've got lots of use of swamp data for helping manage shrimp fisheries, determine what temperature thresholds are important, what salinity thresholds are important, and effects of these water quality parameters on phenology, when the juveniles are dispersing, how big they get, and general productivity. Ace Basin mentioned using their data to model blue crab abundances. They also mentioned that SCDNR uses the data to understand life histories of, and there was a whole list of animals. The one I remember was eels, but Ace Basin has some really cool things being done with their data. And I should probably mention also, a lot of these examples are in our preprints, but some of them were pulled from a sort of internal reserve system document where research coordinators at every reserve were asked, what's your data being used for? And as you can imagine, it's sort of difficult to get information like that out of people. And I think the way they actually did it was pretty creative, but I'm glad I wasn't a research coordinator at the time. There's an annual gathering of coordinators in the reserve system. And what they did was they had a Wheel of Fortune kind of wheel with all of the reserve names on it, and they spun the wheel and they told people, if it lands on you, you have to give us 3 bullet points of what your data is being used for. They told them that in advance so people could plan, but then they incorporated those bullets into this document. And I wish it wasn't just an internal document. I wish it was shareable because there's so much more cool stuff than what I'm telling you. But there is some more. Elkhorn Slough, which is on the West Coast, uses their data to help manage wetlands behind water control structures. Alternately, what are the optimal times when water can be drawn to fill waterfowl impoundments? That's another ACE Basin one. Multiple reserves are having their data used to construct drought indices. Multiple reserves are interested in studying marine heat waves. Multiple reserves are interested in using satellite imagery, and they're using swamp data to sort of calibrate these satellite models. One of these reserves is Chesapeake Bay, Virginia. Dave Parrish is giving a talk on that later this week, so I encourage you to go if you're interested in that. There's a lot of ecosystem metabolism work as well. Jane Caffrey at University of West Florida has done quite a lot. There was a recent project out of Penn State where there's a new publication just out where they found Bayesian methods of working this up. And they used, again, multiple reserves across the system. This final one from 2018, they also looked at 19 reserves to look at pH and dissolved oxygen variability and determine the metabolic impacts, what might be contributing to this variability. So all kinds of things that bits and pieces of data can be used for. But then we also have several system-wide efforts. One of the strengths of a program like this is, yeah, we're all in very different places and very different conditions, but because we've got the same methods, the same data structure, the same database, you can look at the data in the same way at a variety of scales. One of the first really big public efforts of this, I encourage you to check out this website. Marcus Beck, who's in the room, and Todd O'Brien created some interactive widgets using R Shiny, and they update the data every year. So you can look at a historical summary of a station. You can get the same output for any of the, what did I say? We have 30 reserves times 4 stations each, at least 120 stations. You could see it the same way, same box plots, same heat maps. There's also a mapping application where you can see trends, just simple linear regression, but you can put it on a map and see what's happening at a national scale. And then again, dig into an individual station if you want to. Another effort, or two sort of related efforts, allow for consistent reporting across, focused on a single reserve, but it looks the same no matter which reserve you go to. One of these was called Swamp Status Reports, and it was meant to be run annually and let reserves pick and choose what was the most interesting water quality thing that happened that year. What is the story that we want to tell the public? And then there was a friendly template that you can get these graphics and data into to help disseminate that. Storm Stories is a project that built off of that, used a very similar structure, but instead of a calendar year, it would let you put in information about a specific storm, so a specific hurricane. Similar efforts, not on water quality data, have happened for surface elevation table data and more recently vegetation monitoring data. This is another, I think, strength of the system. When they do these monitoring programs or they implement these procedures, they try to find protocols that will be consistent across the system so that you can do syntheses like this, but then also look at individual sites the way you want to. So it exists for sets for veg data, and there are efforts to do similar things for seagrasses and mangroves. Now, another really big project that was sort of a tight timeline, actually, but I think has been really important, is using swamp data across the system to look at trends in eutrophication and hypoxia. And there's a talk at this conference. It's only in Hoover. Kate Reinl will not be here, but she's the one you want to look up. We used 99 stations that had at least 10 years of data. We looked at least 20 years of, or we capped it at 20 years because nutrient sampling really only started consistently in 2002. So we looked at 10 to 20 years of data across the system and found widespread increases in temperature, which is maybe not surprising, widespread increases in chlorophyll and decreases in dissolved oxygen. And we did some modeling of the drivers. So Kate has some really cool maps. I encourage you to go to her presentation or check it out in the app, but I'll show you a few histograms of just the trends. We just calculated a slope. Actually, we used GAMS. We accounted for seasonality and autocorrelation and all that good stuff, censoring. And this is a histogram of slopes. So there's a, do I have the pointer here? Yeah, there's a vertical line at 0. So blue is, hey, this trend was statistically significant, and red is, it was not. These are unadjusted p-values if you care about that sort of thing. But it's still really striking, like most of these trends are increases in temperature. Chlorophyll, this is actually log chlorophyll. So here's 0. Again, quite a lot of increases across the country. And then oxygen, monthly medians. When you have 15-minute data, you really have to zoom out a lot. But this is monthly median dissolved oxygen. So again, we modeled potential drivers. Check out Kate Reynolds' talk. She'll have a lot more information. Very big deal, very big way to be using national data like this. We're also working on some dashboards just to try to make data generally more accessible, more easy to see. This particular map looks a lot like the Swamp Rats map, but we've got not just dissolved oxygen concentrations, but people are interested in hypoxia specifically as an indicator. Of course, there are different definitions of what level is hypoxic, so we're looking at both 2 and 5 milligrams per liter. I've also heard 3 and 4 milligrams per liter thrown around today, but we chose 2 and 5 just to try to pick some of the major numbers. This map is not showing trends, but this one is choose whatever year you want, and you can see how much of the year was hypoxic at any given station. So this is still in development, and we're building a bit of a website around it to provide context and information for, like, why do we care and what is happening in some of these places. We want to add some case studies. How's my time? Perfect. So that is coming along. Hopefully we'll unveil that in this summer. So some lessons learned, things that have worked really well for the system. One is this consistent data management. There are multiple rounds of QA/QC with quarterly submissions, and then every year you have to go back through and compile that into an annual submission. So that is at the reserve level, you're seeing each piece of data twice. And there's also a centralized data management office, which I'm just realizing I didn't put into the presentation, but there will be a link because that's where you download data. And they do another round of QA/QC to do what's called authentication. So they'll flag anything the reserve missed and make sure that data is really high quality. Hey, there's the link. I did include them on the slide. We also have really consistent standards and oversight. There's actually a data management committee and an oversight committee. So it's not just everybody doing their own thing. There's quite a lot of coordination on this program. The consistency is really great. Using the same methods, using the same tools, as I've already mentioned, the same way for any station. That is really a good thing about this program. But really, I think the best thing about SWAMP is the people. And at this bigger scale of using monitoring data for management, we haven't talked yet about the people that are out there on the water, getting the data, scrubbing the biofouling off the loggers, fixing the electronics that aren't working. They are just really amazing people and a really amazing community. And one of the ways that they have worked to build this throughout this national system is that every year there's an annual technician training workshop where they pull all of the techs from all of the reserve, well, not all of the techs, 1 tech per reserve they will pay for, but they pull everybody from across the system together, they get them in the room, and they talk about, you know, their training. They go through calibration of a data sonde. They go through what are the methods we need to use for nutrients, and to make sure everybody's on the same page. But I think even more important than that training information is just being together, because that's where the ideas come out. And you hear someone is cleaning their sonde tubes with like a chimney brush, and that really helps knock the barnacles off or something like that. It's those exchanges that really help spread ideas and spread good practices. There's also an email listserv, And I have found that the Swamp community responds faster to emails than any other listserv I've ever been on. You have a question about what lock is most rust resistant so that I can lock up my deployment tube and try to prevent vandalism, and you'll have answers within 10 minutes if someone's at their computer. They're really great people. But there have been challenges, of course. Data management, surprise, it's my first bullet on this slide too. This has evolved over the years for the system, and the QA/QC procedures have evolved over the years as well, which I'm sure came with challenges, but that was before my time, lucky me. But some of the bigger challenges are for these non-core programs. Set monitoring and vegetation monitoring are not required yet. They are strongly encouraged, but they're not funded. And so even if you tell people this is the way that you should store your data in a spreadsheet, spreadsheets evolve and you get very different data storage from different reserves. So there have been some pretty big efforts to pull data into similar formats that are not already hosted by the CDMO. There's also always some subjectivity in QA/QC. When are you going to flag something as a bad data point? They try to be very consistent, and having the CDMO, that centralized data management office, oversee really does help a lot. But there's always some little bit where if you're just analyzing a single reserve's data, you're probably going to be able to dig in and keep a lot more data than you would at the national scale, where you're just like, if someone flagged it as suspect, it's out of my analysis. Equipment and maintenance, of course, always a challenge. Equipment evolving has been a real great thing for the program, but equipment goes bad and it's expensive to maintain and difficult. And if your program isn't planning for this, you can run into a situation where all your data loggers are broken and you need all new ones. So it's really best to just try to plan for that. And then staff turnover has been another big challenge. Not a consensus, but the thing that they say about turnover in Swamp is that people are there for about 2 years. There are some long timers, but most people aren't there for very long. And given how important the people are and how much they turn into experts about anything, I think it's worth thinking about, if you're running a monitoring program, how do you keep people? How do you reward them? Make sure you're not seeing them or referring to them or treating them as just a tech. Because I think in science, there's a lot of division between who is the investigator and who is just the tech. But if these people can fix things with duct tape and zip ties, right? They are experts. Pay attention to them. Try to keep them. Easier said than done, especially in these financial times. The other big thing is, since you're out there anyway, we're always going out there, and it's really easy to add on. Since you're going out there anyway, can you grab this sample? That can be really great. Since you're going out there, can you take this grad student? Sure. But you need to be thoughtful about it, because there are other things where you've already got a full day, longer than an 8-hour day to do your sampling. And if someone tries to add something to the program consistently for more than just a small little study, but they want to make it maybe a core part of Swamp, you really want to think about that effort trade-off, because it's not nothing to add to what people are doing. It can be worth it, but it's not nothing. So think about that before you say, since you're out anyway. Think about what you're asking and how long of a commitment you're asking for. So you can download Swamp data, get more information about the stations. There was a project a couple of years ago called Swamp Clue that did a lot of land classification information for each station. There's a link to our preprint, and you are also welcome to email me if you have any additional questions. Thank you.
All right. This was the last talk of the afternoon for this session. There's time to go catch another one if you want. So feel free to get up and find that one that you've been waiting for. Otherwise, we got plenty of time to chat, and you can ask Kim a question or two if you want.
Yes.
data in WQX?
Is the swamp data in WQX? Not to my knowledge. Yes, Ed.
Thank you. So development made about the human capital of maintaining personnel and expertise within the system-wide monitoring program. What do you think has been the biggest effort across the years to maintain that integrity of the technicians and monitoring program staff?
Ooh.
Getting beyond that 2-year turnover rate.
I'm gonna come back to the mic and try to repeat the question. What's been the biggest effort to try to retain people across the years and try to improve on that 2-year turnover rate? I don't know that there's been anything formal, but since I started with the NEARS, I have seen a big evolution in attitude of some of the higher ups towards more appreciation, more support, but not just, hey, morale is low, let's throw a pizza party. What I have seen really helping is getting more staff on Swamp. There have been several reserves that only had a single staff person. Mine was that way when I started. And it doesn't work. It's too much for one person. So being realistic about what the staffing need is, and hiring those people. I don't know if I've seen that play out enough to say that's helped with retention, but I've seen that help with the morale of my fellow techs when I was one.
Great. Any other questions for Kim?
Marcus.
Just on one page, you showed looking at trends and this across the reserves. You showed the temperature, DO, chlorophyll, and sure that's what you didn't show. You have any idea whether you brought systematic trends?
Question was, we showed graphs of temperature, chlorophyll, DO. Were there any trends in salinity? We looked at it. We calculated, I think it was 8 different parameters, and those were the only 3 that were really like consistently, there is something big and systematic happening here. I think all of the information is going to be available and open once that comes out. Like, we're not trying to cherry pick what we show, but yeah, there wasn't anything big and glaring with salinity. Yes. We were looking at long-term trends. We discussed seasonality and really wanted to make it part of the analysis, but it became such a big, difficult to do thing that we just fit a generalized additive model where we had a spline for seasonality to account for it, and we didn't look at the separate seasons. But that is a great question because that's very important, especially in some places. They know that temperature is increasing more in summer. And so maybe you don't see that trend when you're looking at the whole time series. But yeah, we didn't do that, unfortunately. That's the next project.
Okay, we don't have any other questions. I'd like to thank all 3 of our speakers. We'll see you at the exhibitors summit.
Yeah. Okay.